Der 18. Dezember 1944, Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Snow fell in slow, soundless sheets, blanketing the broken trees and the wreckage of men. For Private First Class Jack Brenner, the silence was worse than the bullets. Somewhere beyond the fog and timberline, a German marksman had already taken 3 men from his platoon, one through the throat while lighting a cigarette, another mid-sentence as he called for a medic. The shots came without warning, the sound swallowed by the forest, the muzzle flash invisible in the haze. Brenner pressed his cheek against the frozen soil, breath steadying as he scanned through his M1903.OR A4 scope. Nothing, just mist, branches, and death waiting somewhere in between. His spotter, Corporal Lee Haynes, whispered, "He's moving with the fog. Bastard knows this forest better than we do." Jack didn't answer. He was listening. Not for words, not for gunfire, for rhythm. Every sniper he'd met before the war swore by sight, by patience, by glass. But Brenner had grown up different. Back home in rural Kentucky, sound had been his hunting partner, the whine of a deer's breath, the crack of twigs, the way echo bounced off valley walls. As a kid, he could tell the size of a rabbit just by how fast the rustle stopped. Now, in this cursed forest, those instincts were all he had left. A faint metallic click reached him, not loud but distinct. Brenner froze. It wasn't nature, it was machinery. The rifle's bolt cycling somewhere to the northwest. His heart slowed. He mouthed the number silently. 70 yards left, 30 up. He adjusted his rifle slightly off instinct alone. Then he did something Lee had never seen. He set down his scope and closed his eyes. "What the hell are you doing?" Lee hissed. Jack whispered, listening to the trees. Another sound. A small gust, not wind pressure from a muzzle cutting through air. Brenner fired a fraction of a second after it. His Springfield cracked once, the echo swallowed instantly by the forest. Silence returned. Then, a shape slumped from a branch 30 yards away, a man, wrapped in winter camouflage, rifle falling beside him. The German sniper. Lee exhaled hard. "You didn't even look through the scope." Brenner's lips curved faintly. Didn't need to. The platoon advanced cautiously through the snow, retrieving the fallen enemy's rifle, a scoped Car 98K with a suppressor welded crudely to its muzzle. No wonder they hadn't seen the flash. No wonder the man had been so quiet. Lieutenant Hawkins radioed command. "Enemy sniper down, estimated position neutralized." Then to Brenner, "Good work, son. That shot saved this patrol." Brenner only nodded. But in his mind, it wasn't luck. It was math. Not on paper, but in sound. The forest had spoken. He'd just learned how to listen. That night, around a small fire dug into a snow pit, the men of Baker Company passed around a can of beans and their stories. One corporal called Brenner the blind sniper, laughing between shivers. Lee didn't laugh. He'd seen Brenner hit a target he couldn't even see. "What the hell was that trick?" Lee asked later, when it was just the two of them. Brenner pulled a scrap of notepad from his jacket pocket, half covered in grease stains. "I've been drawing this out for weeks," he said. The paper showed rough sketches, sound waves bouncing off hills, angles of reflection marked in pencil. Sound don't travel clean in fog. It bends. But in a forest, it bounces off bark, off snow, off rock. You listen long enough, you can map a man without seeing him. Lee frowned. "You saying you can hear distance?" Brenner shrugged. "Not distance, direction. Each echo's got a delay, kind of like how you can tell how far lightning is by counting after thunder, except faster." Lee stared at him, half impressed, half unnerved. "That's not Army doctrine, Brenner. Neither is dying blind." They sat in silence, the fire crackling softly. By morning, Brenner's idea had spread across the camp like wildfire. The captain called him in, skeptical but curious. "You telling me you can find an enemy shooter by sound, alone?" Brenner didn't boast. "I can try. If you give me a few radios, some wire, and a microphone." The captain raised an eyebrow. "You plan on turning into a human radar?" Brenner smiled faintly. "Sir, I grew up between hollers. If the hills can talk, I can listen." The captain studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. Fine. You get your junk. But if this is another one of your hillbilly miracles, I'm sending you to dig latrines until spring. Brenner saluted. Fair deal, sir. As he stepped out into the cold air, the wind whistled faintly through the pines, a low, steady hum like a secret waiting to be decoded. Jack Brenner tilted his head, listening. Tomorrow, he'd try to teach the army how to hear a battlefield. By dawn, the forest had frozen solid, every branch and shell crater crusted in white. Jack Brenner crouched behind a fallen pine, hands buried in a tangle of scavenged wire, field radios, and 2 microphones stolen from an artillery observation post. His breath fogged the air in short bursts. Lee Haines stood over him, shaking his head. You sure this isn't going to get us court-martialed? Probably, Brenner said, not looking up. But if it works, no one will care. They were on the edge of a ravine overlooking the German line, where sound carried in strange, uneven echoes. Brenner had noticed that gunfire from one ridge always reached them twice, once direct, once delayed by a heartbeat as it bounced off the frozen slope. The timing difference, he believed, was a map. He jammed the first microphone into a tree hollow and ran a wire to his portable receiver. The second he buried under snow, 20 feet away. He flipped a switch, and a faint hum filled the headphones around his neck. The static of war wind, distant artillery, the whine of tank treads bled through the airwaves like ghosts whispering from another world. Lee crouched beside him, peering at the crude setup. So what's the plan? You listen, then guess? Brenner smiled slightly. Guessing's what got us shot at yesterday. This is pattern. Sound has shape, even if you can't see it. He adjusted a dial, tuning through chaos until the faint pop of a rifle broke through the static. The signal split in two, one channel first, the other a split second later. He scribbled the difference on a notepad. 0.07 seconds. 70 yards left of our last mark, he muttered. You're sure? Brenner didn't answer. He reached for his rifle, set it on the snowbank, and peered through the scope. Nothing but gray and smoke. He closed his eyes again, breathing slow, waiting. Another pop came through the headphones, followed by a bird scattering from a tree to the left. He fired. A sharp crack echoed back, then silence. Lee stared through his binoculars. Jesus Christ, you got him. Smoke just puffed from the ridge. Brenner pulled off the headphones, rubbing his ears. Sound don't lie, it's just been talking too quiet for anyone to hear. By noon, the experiment had spread to the entire platoon. They called it Brenner's ears. 3 more microphones were wired across the ravine, forming a crude triangle of listening posts. Every time a sniper fired, the time delays on Brenner's receiver drew an invisible line through the fog, and somewhere at its intersection, death waited. The first full test came hours later. A burst of German rifle fire erupted from the opposite ridge, cutting down a medic mid-run. The platoon dove for cover. Brenner hit the receiver, counted the delay, and barked coordinates. 200 yards north, 40 high top of the tree line. He fired 3 times. The shooting stopped. Word spread fast through the battalion. A man who could hear snipers through fog. Officers came crawling through the snow just to watch. Captain Dwyer, grizzled and skeptical, leaned over Brenner's shoulder during one test. You're telling me you can find men by sound alone? Yes, sir, with enough ears. You planning to win this war by listening? Brenner looked up, face smeared with soot. Sir, if sight's useless in this fog, what's left? The captain didn't answer. The results spoke louder than anything Brenner could. By sundown, 5 German snipers had been neutralized using nothing but echoes and timing. That night, Brenner and Lee sat in their dugout, hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Command's talking about sending you to Division HQ, Lee said quietly. They think you built some kind of portable radar. Brenner laughed softly. Radar's for the sky. This, he tapped his temple. This is for the earth. The forest already knows where they are. I'm just listening. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance, a dull, endless growl rolling through the woods like thunder. For the first time since entering the Hurtgen, Brenner felt something like control. The fog wasn't an enemy anymore. It was an ally. And tomorrow, He'd proved that sound, not sight, could turn the tide of a battle. 2 days later, Brenner found himself standing in front of a field tent near Stolberg, half command post, half laboratory. Cables ran through the mud like vines, connecting radios, oscilloscopes, and the nervous energy of men who spoke in acronyms. Across from him stood Major Arthur Klein, an ordnance officer with wire-rimmed glasses and the air of a man who thought he'd already seen everything worth seeing. "So," Klein said, flipping through Brenner's handwritten notes, "you claim you can locate enemy shooters through echoes?" "Not claim, sir. I've done it," Klein frowned. "Using microphones and a stopwatch? And timing delays between signals," Brenner added. "The difference between what one mic hears and the other tells you the angle. 3 mics give you a triangle. The intersection is your shooter." The major sighed. "Private, we already have acoustic location systems. The British tried them in the Great War. They called them sound mirrors. The idea died for a reason." Brenner's eyes didn't waver. "Because they listened for artillery. I'm listening for rifles." The tent went quiet. For a moment, only the hum of the generator filled the air. Klein leaned forward. "And what makes you so sure your Kentucky magic works, where science failed?" Brenner hesitated, then simply said, "Because I was raised where echoes don't lie, sir." The major studied him, the dirt still on his boots, the frost still on his collar, and finally motioned to a corporal. "Set up the test." They brought in a captured German rifle and a volunteer from the engineers. Brenner's ears rig, 3 microphones on field stakes connected to a pair of signal amplifiers, was wired across the clearing. The corporal fired once from an unknown position in the trees. Brenner watched the oscillograph needles twitch, counting under his breath. "0.2 to 6 seconds between mic 1 and 3, he said. "Northwest, 40 degrees. Klein frowned. "That's broad." Brenner pointed toward the tree line. "6th pine from the left, 20 yards up." Klein raised an eyebrow. "Prove it." Brenner lifted his rifle, exhaled, and fired a single shot. A second later, a voice cried out, "Hit! You grazed my damn ear!" The soldiers erupted in laughter. Klein just stared. "Do it again," he said quietly. Brenner did. Another shot. Another perfect hit. When the test ended, Klein didn't smile. He only muttered, "You might have just invented something the Army can't classify yet." By that afternoon, Division Command had summoned Brenner. He rode in the back of a jeep with his gear piled beside him, his microphones, his scrawled notes, his battered Springfield. The driver, a private from Chicago, kept glancing at him. "You, the guy who hears Germans." Brenner chuckled. "Sometimes." They rolled past wrecked tanks and frozen bodies half buried in snow. The smell of cordite and pine mixed into something unforgettable. At HQ, a colonel waited with 2 civilian engineers flown in from London. They bombarded him with questions. Signal frequency, environmental distortion, acoustic delay. Brenner answered the best he could, part intuition, part math scrawled in the dirt. "It's not about sound," he finally said, frustrated. "It's about timing. Sound is just how the forest talks back." The colonel leaned back. "And you think this can scale?" Brenner nodded. "Give me 6 mics in a radio truck. I can map an entire valley." The echoes build a picture in my head. The room fell silent again. The civilian engineers exchanged glances, the kind of look that meant they were either terrified or impressed. "Private Brenner," the colonel said slowly, "you realize this isn't exactly standard procedure. You're modifying comms equipment without authorization." "With respect, sir," Brenner replied evenly. "I'd rather break a rule than bury another friend." That night, Brenner was ordered to stay in camp and assist the engineers. But as he sat outside his tent, Lee found him again, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. "You realize what's happening?" Lee said. "You're about to turn listening into a weapon." Brenner stared into the dark woods. The wind carried the faint creak of frozen branches, a language only he seemed to understand. "I'm not turning it into a weapon," he said softly. "I'm turning it into a warning." Lee smirked. "That's what all inventors say right before the generals steal their ideas." Brenner didn't laugh. Somewhere deep in the forest, a single rifle cracked distant, sharp echoing between the trees. He turned his head slightly, instinctively measuring the delay. 300 yards east, he murmured. "Same ridge as yesterday." Lee blinked. You can tell from one shot? Yeah, Brenner said, standing up and chambering around. And tomorrow, I'll prove it in front of every officer in this army. He walked back into the snow, the forest whispering around him like an old friend. The 23rd of December 1944, the snow hadn't stopped for 3 days. The Hurtgen was more ice than earth now, every trench rimmed with white glass. Inside a small communications truck parked near the ridge, Private Jack Brenner sat surrounded by cables, headphones, and skeptical officers. Outside, the forest was a gray wall of fog. Somewhere out there, German snipers were waiting, the same ones who'd cut down a patrol the night before. Colonel Graves, a compact man with a face carved from suspicion, checked his watch. Private, you've got 10 minutes. After that, we pull out and leave the theories to the scientists. Brenner adjusted his makeshift receiver, his hands steady despite the cold. 10 minutes is plenty, sir. Beside him, Corporal Lee Haynes worked the power supply. 3 microphones were staked across the valley in a rough triangle, one near the creek, another behind a fallen oak, and a third on the ridge overlooking the German approach. It looked primitive, almost laughable. To most of the brass, Brenner's rig was a hillbilly trickfield junk and stolen comms gear patched together with tape and frozen wire. But the colonel needed results. Every man in the 110th Infantry was tired of dying without ever seeing who fired the shot. Static's clean, Lee said, tapping the side of the receiver. Brenner nodded. Now we wait. It didn't take long. The first shot came from the west slope, a crack so faint it could have been a branch snapping. The oscillograph needles jumped. Brenner counted silently. 1, 2, he scribbled numbers. Delay 0.13 seconds between mic 2 and 3. That's 70 yards south of the river fork. He turned to the colonel. There's your shooter. Graves frowned. You're basing that on what, sound math? Before Brenner could answer, another shot came closer, sharper. The needles danced again. Brenner adjusted the dial, listening. Same man, he said. Moved left 20 yards, probably adjusting for line of sight. The colonel looked through his binoculars. I see nothing. Brenner didn't reply. He picked up his rifle, opened the truck's side door, and crouched behind the snowbank. He listened again, the faint echo of the shooter's bolt sliding home. He exhaled. Fired once. A brief pause. Then, far across the valley, a dark shape tumbled from the ridge. Jesus, muttered one of the radio techs. Graves lowered the binoculars, eyes wide. He's down. Brenner chambered another round, scanning the soundscape. There's more. They're working in pairs. The second sniper fired almost immediately, but Brenner was already listening. The sound hit microphone, 1 first, then 3. He ran the math in his head. North Ridge, by the dead oak. The colonel relayed coordinates to the mortar team. A single shell dropped into the forest with terrifying precision. A muffled explosion. Silence. Direct hit, said Lee quietly. Graves stared at Brenner's setup like it was witchcraft. You're doing this in real time. Brenner nodded, tuning the dials. As long as I can hear them, I can find them. Another sound came through, not a rifle, but a heavy, deliberate thump. Brenner froze. That wasn't small arms. Mortar tube, he said, eyes widening. They're walking fire toward this truck. The colonel cursed. Can you get a bearing? Brenner's fingers moved over the knobs. Give me 10 seconds. He listened as the second shell launched the faint whoosh, then the slap of echo. 1. 70 east behind the farmhouse ruins. Graves barked into the radio. Counter battery, coordinates incoming, fire for effect. The American mortars answered. 3 shells landed in rapid sequence. The German fire stopped. Smoke drifted through the fog. The forest fell silent again, except for the static hum of Brenner's machine. When the echo died, the colonel turned slowly toward him. You just saved my command post. Brenner removed the headphones, sweat beading under his helmet despite the cold. No, sir. The forest did. I just listened. Graves studied the setup, the wires, the microphones, the crude wiring board with Brenner's handwritten labels. You realize what you've done? Brenner shrugged. Found a better way to hear men trying to kill us. The colonel smirked faintly. That's not what I meant. I'm talking about detection, range finding, hell, battlefield acoustics. You just built something we've been throwing millions at. Brenner looked out into the mist where the echoes had died. If it saves lives, that's all I need. Graves nodded slowly. You'll be hearing from higher command. I guarantee it. That night, under dim lamplight, Brenner sat in the back of the truck, drawing schematics on a piece of ration paper, loops of wire, signal paths, numbers scrawled beside tiny ear symbols. Lee leaned against the wall, sipping black coffee. You think they'll let you keep running this setup? Brenner smiled faintly. Not a chance. The brass will take it, lock it up, and pretend they invented it. Lee chuckled. Then what? Brenner's eyes flicked toward the snow-covered ridge. Then I'll make another one. Outside, somewhere deep in the Hurtgen, a delayed echo rolled through the forest, soft, ghostly, and strangely reassuring. He couldn't see the enemy anymore, but he could hear everything. 3 days later, a jeep rolled into Brenner's outpost, carrying 2 men in clean uniforms that looked like they'd never seen mud. The insignia on their sleeves read, U.S. Army Signal Corps. Their boots were polished. Their eyes were cold. One of them stepped out, tall and pale, with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Private Jack Brenner? Brenner wiped grease off his hands and stood. That's me. Congratulations, the man said flatly. You've just been transferred. To where? The officer smiled without warmth. To where they pay attention when you make miracles out of scrap metal. By nightfall, Brenner was sitting in the back of a transport truck, rumbling toward Aachen. The ride was long, filled with rain and silence. The only sound came from the hum of the engine and the constant drip of melting snow on the canvas roof. Across from him sat Lee Haynes, his spotter, clutching a cigarette that had burned to the filter. You're really coming? Brenner asked. Someone's got to make sure you don't get eaten alive by the brass, Lee said. Besides, I'm not letting you take credit for my wire work. Brenner laughed, once the kind of dry laugh that comes from fatigue more than humor. They arrived at a commandeered factory on the outskirts of Aachen. The sign outside still bore its pre-war name in faded German script. Klangwerke, Soundworks. Inside, the assembly lines had been stripped and replaced with rows of tables, each piled high with radio guts and signal analyzers. Major Klein, the same ordnance officer who'd tested Brenner's setup days before, was there to greet him. Welcome to the Echo section, Klein said, motioning toward a group of men in lab coats hunched over a map covered in concentric circles. Your invention's the reason this place exists now. Brenner frowned. Invention? It's just a few mics and some wire. That's how radar started too, Klein replied. Sit down, Private. You're going to teach the smartest men in the Army how you pulled it off. For hours, Brenner explained everything. The delays, the math, the triangulation. He drew diagrams, built mock-ups, even demonstrated his listening triangle, using spare cans and a field phone. The engineers scribbled furiously, but as the questions went on, something in his gut turned. So, theoretically, one civilian asked, if we expanded your method, say, lined a dozen of these microphones along a valley, we could track every gunshot within miles. Yes, Brenner said slowly, but that's not what I built it for. It's meant to protect. The civilian smirked. Protection is just prevention, Private. The more accurately we find them, the fewer shots we need to fire. The room murmured in agreement. That's when Brenner realized what they saw, not a survival tool, but a weapon system. His ears had become their eyes. Later that night, he and Lee stood outside the factory, smoking under a broken street lamp. Snow drifted down, muffling the world. You see their faces in there? Lee said. They're not building your rig anymore. They're building a goddamn death machine. Brenner stared at the empty road. They'll call it progress. They always do. You going to stop them? He hesitated. I can't. Not anymore. They'll take it apart, rebuild it, stamp a number on it, and send it back into the field. Lee blew smoke into the cold air. And you'll get a medal for it. Brenner gave a humorless smile. Yeah, the kind they hand out after they bury enough people. The next morning, they tested the scaled-up system. 12 microphones lined a snowy ridge, all connected to a central truck. When a German artillery piece fired 3 miles away, the echo section pinpointed it within seconds. Fire control. Coordinate grid shaptes prezeche. Klein barked. American howitzers answered instantly, flattening the gun position before the Germans could reload. The room erupted in applause. Brenner just stood there, numb. Klein clapped him on the shoulder. You just made counter-battery fire twice as fast. The brass will love you for this. Brenner looked out through the cracked truck window. Smoke rose on the horizon, black columns twisting into the gray sky. He muttered, "Funny thing about sound, Major. You listen long enough, you start hearing ghosts." That night, he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the walls, every crack of distant artillery echoed through his mind like whispers of what he'd started. Lee found him hunched over his notebook, erasing and redrawing the same line over and over. "What are you doing?" Lee asked quietly. "Trying to make it deaf again," Brenner said. Lee frowned. "You mean, if they're going to use it to kill more people than it saves, maybe I'll make sure it can't hear so well anymore." Lee stared at him, realizing what he meant: sabotage. Brenner set down his pencil. "You ever wonder if sometimes silence is the only way to win a war?" The snow fell thicker that night, blurring the shapes of men and machines into a single gray mass. Inside the commandeered factory at Aachen, the echo section hummed with noise-electric hum, typewriter clicks, the hiss of burning solder. Outside, Private Jack Brenner sat alone on an overturned ammo crate, a cigarette glowing faintly between his fingers. The sound of the war was changing. He could feel it. What began as a way to save his unit, to hear death coming before it struck, had become something else entirely. His rig now stretched across half a mile of field cables, connecting to fire control stations that spat out death with machine precision. The brass called it real-time acoustic targeting. The newspapers would one day call it revolutionary. To Brenner, it sounded like guilt made mechanical. Lee found him in the cold, shoulders hunched, staring toward the ridgeline where his microphones gleamed under the moonlight. "You're still thinking about it, huh?" Lee asked. Brenner nodded. "They're using it to zero artillery on villages. Yesterday, I heard children crying through those lines, Lee. I knew where the sound came from. I knew what would happen next. You didn't pull the trigger. I gave them the coordinates." His voice cracked. Same thing. The next morning, the test continued. The Echo rig had been fully integrated into the 3rd Artillery Division's operations. A team of engineers now managed the equipment, reducing Brenner's role to that of a reluctant consultant. He watched Major Klein direct the test, a live-fire trial against a German position 5 miles east. The technicians manned their stations, headphones pressed tight, graphs spooling across the paper recorders. "Target detected," one of them shouted. "Quadrant 6, range confirmed. Fire control, load charge 7, Klein barked. Within seconds, American 155mm shells screamed overhead. The earth shook. When the dust cleared, another technician announced, "Confirmed kills, sir. 5 guns destroyed." Applause filled the room. Cameras clicked. Someone even opened a bottle of champagne in a factory that still smelled of blood and diesel. Brenner turned away. That night, he returned to the signal room long after everyone had gone. The only light came from a single desk lamp. On the table lay the master schematic, the core junction that synchronized the entire Echo grid. Without it, the timing between microphones would drift, rendering the targeting useless. He stared at it for a long time, cigarette burning down to ash. Lee's voice came from the shadows. "If you do it, they'll find out." Brenner didn't look up. "Maybe. Maybe not. You'll be court-martialed. I'd rather be court-martialed than have another farm burned because I built a better way to aim." He picked up a screwdriver, loosened a panel, and carefully pulled a small capacitor from the circuit board. It was subtle, a change so small no one would notice until the entire grid was misaligned by milliseconds. Enough to make every shot miss by miles. When he finished, he exhaled slowly. "There," he said. "Let them listen to silence for once." The next day, the offensive began. Artillery crews stood ready, the Echo section feeding coordinates into range tables. Brenner sat beside Klein, pretending to take notes. "Target bearing east," a technician shouted. "Signal confirmed." Klein turned to Brenner. "Time to show the world what you built." Brenner nodded grimly. "Yes, sir." The first salvo roared. The sky flashed orange. Seconds later, the radio lit up with confused chatter shells landing short, impacts scattering wide across empty fields. "Recheck calibration," Klein barked. Another salvo, another miss. What the hell is going on? The technicians scrambled, adjusting knobs, recalculating ranges. Nothing worked. The echoes didn't line up. The rhythm, the heartbeat of the machine was gone. Brenner sat still, his jaw tight, pretending to share their confusion. Klein slammed his fist on the table. "Shut it down. God damn it, shut it all down." When the firing finally stopped, the field was eerily quiet. The Germans, realizing their advantage, returned fire. A shell landed near the truck, knocking Brenner and Lee to the floor. Smoke filled the air. Someone screamed. "Jack," Lee shouted. "We gotta move." Brenner looked through the haze and saw the broken microphones outside, their wires snapping in the wind like torn nerves. "Leave it," he said. "It's already done." Hours later, after the smoke cleared, Klein found him sitting on the frozen ground, bleeding from a cut above his brow. "What happened?" the major demanded. "The whole system failed." Brenner looked up, his expression calm. "Maybe it was never meant to work that way." Klein glared. "If I find out you won't," Brenner interrupted softly. "And even if you did, you'd still need me to fix it." The major stared at him for a long moment, realizing perhaps that the quiet soldier before him was the only man who could rebuild the miracle he'd just destroyed. That night, as Brenner and Lee huddled in the ruins of the command post, Lee broke the silence. "You know they'll come for you, right?" "Maybe," Brenner said, staring into the dark. "But they'll have to listen real close to find me." The forest outside was silent now. No echoes, no gunfire, no machines. For the first time since the Ardennes, the world around them was quiet. And Jack Brenner, the man who could hear everything, finally heard peace. The snow stopped 2 days later, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than any bombardment. The echo section was gone evacuated, scattered after the system's mysterious failure. The factory at Aachen stood empty now, black smoke curling from its broken windows. Private Jack Brenner and Corporal Lee Haynes were reassigned to a small forward listening post outside Monschau, a polite way of saying, "Watch the trees and stay out of sight." To Brenner, that suited him fine. He didn't want to see another oscilloscope or timing chart again. But the army wasn't done with him. On the third morning, a jeep rolled up to the outpost. 2 MPs stepped out, followed by a captain in intelligence gray. His uniform was crisp, his tone colder than the wind. "Private Brenner," he said, "you're under investigation for gross negligence and possible sabotage of government equipment." Lee stiffened. "That's insane." The captain cut him off. "Save it. You'll both come with us for questioning." Brenner didn't resist. He simply stood, brushed the frost off his jacket, and followed. They brought him to a half-collapsed barn outside Liège, converted into a makeshift interrogation room. Inside, a kerosene lamp flickered against the walls, casting long shadows over a map of the Western Front. Major Klein was waiting. His uniform was singed, his face bruised. "You cost us 50 men that day," Klein said quietly. 50 good men because your system went dead." Brenner stared at the floor. 50 men because you turned my ears into a weapon." Klein slammed his hand on the table. "You think you get to decide how the army fights this war? You think you get to choose when we use what you built?" "No," Brenner said softly. "I think I get to choose what I break." The major's eyes burned. "You're lucky this isn't a firing squad. But command doesn't want to lose a genius, even a reckless one." He leaned closer. "So they're giving you one chance to make it right. Fix it, tonight." Brenner met his gaze. "And if I don't? Then I make sure the MPs find your fingerprints on every circuit that failed." They brought him back to the wrecked factory. The wires were still there, tangled like veins ripped from the earth. The microphones lay shattered in the snow, their black cords stiff with frost. Lee worked beside him, face tight with anger. "You can't fix what you broke, Jack. Not without giving it back to them." "I know." Brenner crouched beside the junction box, pretending to work while thinking. "But there's another way." "What do you mean?" He lowered his voice. "They want sound. I'll give it to them, too much of it." Lee blinked. You're going to overload it? Not exactly. Brenner adjusted a cable, rewired a terminal, and inserted a small piece of metal between two connectors. If I push the gain past maximum, every echo in this valley will bounce back at once. It'll make the entire system deaf for good. Lee's eyes widened. That'll fry every receiver from here to the base. Yeah, Brenner said, smiling faintly. Let's make some noise. That night, they ran the system one last time. Klein stood behind them, arms folded, impatient. Well, does it work? Brenner gave a small nod. You'll hear soon enough, sir. He flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air itself seemed to vibrate, a low hum rising from the ground, echoing off the valley walls. The dials spun wildly, needles slamming against the limits. What the hell is that? Klein shouted. Brenner didn't answer. The hum grew into a roar, then into a scream, an avalanche of feedback that rattled the windows and sent sparks flying from every console. The sound was unbearable, like the earth itself was shouting back. The lights burst, the cables snapped. The entire network collapsed in a single surge of noise that rolled across the valley and died in an instant. Then, silence. Thick, absolute, holy silence. Smoke rose from the machines. Klein staggered to his feet, shouting, "You destroyed it!" Brenner looked at him through the haze. "No, Major. I just made it stop listening. They left him in the ruins after that, stripped of rank, assigned to menial duty at a field hospital." But word spread quickly. Some said the Echo rig had exploded on its own. Others whispered that its inventor had silenced it on purpose. A few of the radio operators started calling it the day the forest went deaf. And though no one ever proved what really happened, every man who'd been near Aachen that night swore the same thing for the rest of the war. That valley never echoed again. Winter clung to Belgium like a ghost that wouldn't leave. By February, the front had shifted east, leaving behind 1,000 frozen craters and one disgraced soldier who couldn't hear half the world anymore. Private Jack Brenner now wore a Red Cross armband instead of his unit patch. They'd reassigned him to a field hospital on the outskirts of Malmedy, a polite punishment. Not prison, not execution, just quiet. The silence wasn't mercy. It was a sentence. He could still hear muffled sounds, boots crunching in snow, the occasional cough from a wounded man, but his ears rang constantly, an endless tone like a wire humming under tension. The explosion that killed the Echo rig had burned out part of his hearing. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once heard everything now lived inside his own echo. Days passed in monotony. Brenner hauled stretchers, cleaned instruments, carried bodies to the tent, out back when their breathing stopped. He didn't talk much. The nurses learned to tap him on the shoulder before speaking. Sometimes he'd pause and close his eyes, trying to hear what wasn't there, the rhythm of a faraway engine, the faint whistle of a falling shell, but all he got was the endless ring. At night, he sat by the stove with Corporal Lee Haynes, who'd been reassigned with him. Lee's left arm was in a sling, his face pale from weeks of exhaustion. "You ever think we did the right thing?" Lee asked one night. Brenner stared into the fire. "You mean breaking it?" "Yeah." Brenner didn't answer at first. The flames flickered in his eyes like the dying pulse of something mechanical. "If I hadn't, they'd still be using it to erase villages. We gave them silence. That's worth something." Lee smiled faintly. "You always were better at hearing ghosts than orders." One cold morning, the peace shattered. It started as a tremor, faint, rhythmic, familiar. Brenner looked up from the supply tent, his instincts firing before his mind caught up. He couldn't hear the impact clearly, but he felt it, the distant thump of heavy guns. Then came the muffled concussions. The sky flashed white. "Artillery!" someone yelled. The field hospital erupted in chaos. Medics dove for cover as the first shell hit the motor pool, flipping a truck like a toy. Another struck the communications tent, shredding canvas and men alike. Brenner grabbed Lee and dragged him behind a sandbag wall. "They've got our range," Lee shouted. Brenner couldn't hear him, but he knew the look: panic, recognition, the sound of death approaching. Through the haze, he saw the source. A German artillery battery hidden somewhere across the frozen valley. They'd been found, and nobody was listening. He ran to the radio truck, where a young operator was shouting into the headset. "We've lost calibration. The counter-battery network's down." Brenner's pulse quickened. Down. The ecosystem had been dismantled. Scattered, but not completely. He knew there were still spare microphones stored with medical supplies. Pieces of his old rig forgotten by the brass. "Where's the supply crate from Aachen?" he shouted, not sure if he even said it loud enough. The operator blinked, confused. "What?" Brenner shoved past him, ran outside, found the crate half buried in snow behind the mess tent. Inside, coils of wire, 2 half-broken microphones, and a battered amplifier. Lee appeared, bleeding from a cut on his forehead. "Jack, you can't." "I can," Brenner said. "I still remember how it listens." They worked fast, running wires through the trenches, hammering stakes into the frozen mud. Brenner set up the microphones in a triangle pattern, his old design, stripped down, raw. Lee watched him connect the wires to the field radio. "You think it'll work without the rest of it?" "It doesn't need the rest," Brenner muttered. "It just needs ears." He adjusted the gain, tuning out the ringing in his own head, forcing himself to focus. For a moment, the air was still. Then, he heard it. Not clearly. Not like before, but deep inside the ringing, a low pulse. Boom. 2 seconds. Boom. "Range. 4 miles, he said quietly. "Elevation. 60 meters above the riverbed." Lee relayed it to the gunners. Within seconds, American howitzers fired back. The first salvo landed short. The second found its mark. The third silenced the valley. When the echoes faded, only the wind remained. Brenner sank to his knees, hands trembling. The world was quiet again, but this time, it was the silence of survival, not guilt. Lee crouched beside him, grinning through exhaustion. "You did it, Jack. You found them, without even hearing." Brenner smiled faintly, his lips barely moving. "No, I just remembered what silence sounds like before it dies." That night, as the medics patched up the wounded and the fire burned low, Brenner sat outside, watching snow fall through the smoke. His hearing was almost gone now, but the stillness around him was perfect, a peace earned, not given. For the first time since Aachen, he didn't feel haunted by the echoes. He'd learned to listen to something purer, the space between sounds, where truth lives and war finally ends. By the time the smoke lifted from the valley, the story had already started to spread. Word traveled fast among soldiers desperate for something other than bad news. They said a half-deaf private had done what whole batteries of engineers couldn't herd the enemy without hearing at all. But inside the field hospital, Jack Brenner didn't feel like a hero. He lay on a cot, his hands bandaged from the shrapnel blast that had cut through the radio truck. His world was muffled now, drowned in the constant ringing that had followed him since Aachen. Every sound came filtered through that metallic humboots crunching on snow, morphine bottles clinking, nurses whispering like ghosts in another world. Sometimes, he couldn't tell whether the war was still going on, or if it had already ended and no one told him. 2 officers arrived the next morning, one from Signal Corps, another from intelligence. They asked questions like lawyers building a case. "How exactly did you locate the German battery? Did you use remnants of the echo equipment? Were you aware that the system had been classified destroyed?" Brenner just stared at them, half lie-preding, half guessing. "It wasn't the machine," he finally said. "It was pattern. Rhythm. You can feel it if you've heard enough death." They exchanged glances. The younger one whispered something like, "instinct," and the older officer scoffed. "Instinct doesn't win artillery duels, Private. Precision does." Brenner's gaze hardened. "Then maybe you should ask the Germans how precise dead feels." When they left, Lee Haynes leaned against the cot. "They're not going to let this go," he said quietly. "You embarrassed half the Signal Corps." Brenner nodded slowly. "They think what I did was luck. They're wrong. You going to tell them how you really did it?" Brenner shook his head. "No, I think they've heard enough from me." 3 weeks later, a letter came. It wasn't an award, it was a transfer. Effective immediately, Private Brenner was reassigned to a research detachment in Reims, France. Acoustic Applications Division. Lee read it aloud, his voice bitter. "They're pulling you back into it. Brenner smiled faintly. Guess they want their ears tuned again. But when he arrived in Reims, he didn't find scientists. He found soldiers, the kind who didn't wear names on their uniforms, men from OSS and counterintelligence. They ushered him into a dark hangar where strange equipment hummed in the corner. Arrays of microphones, wire spools, experimental sound locators. A colonel with horn-rimmed glasses handed him a cigarette. "You made quite an impression, son. Command thinks your, intuition could help us track V2 rocket sites." Brenner lit the cigarette with shaking hands. "You want me to hear rockets that travel faster than sound?" The colonel smiled. "That's the beauty of it. We think you can hear them before they launch." Brenner laughed once, a dry, joyless sound. "I'm not your prophet. I'm just a man with broken ears." "Then use what's left," the colonel said, "before the Germans finish what they started." For the next month, Brenner worked inside that hangar. They wired the coasts, strung listening posts along the channel, even used seismographs to catch faint tremors. But what haunted him wasn't the rockets. It was the memory of that night at Aachen, the sound collapsing in on itself, the silence swallowing everything. One evening, while calibrating a new microphone array, he noticed something strange. The devices picked up vibrations steady, rhythmic, but not from Germany. They were echoes from his side, from Allied artillery tests far away. The machines were learning to listen like him. They were learning his silence. He realized then that the army didn't need him anymore. They'd built what they wanted all along, a weapon that could hear what men shouldn't. When his work ended, Brenner walked out of the hangar without a word. He never went back. Lee found him 2 weeks later, sitting beside a quiet canal near Reims, staring at the ripples on the water. "You could have been promoted," Lee said. "You built something nobody else could." Brenner didn't turn. "I also destroyed something nobody else would. Balance feels fair." Lee sighed. "So what now?" "I listen," Brenner said simply. "Not for war, just for what's left." That night, far off in the distance, a thunder rolled, not artillery, not rockets, just a spring storm breaking over the horizon. Brenner closed his eyes, the faintest smile crossing his face. He couldn't hear the rain anymore, not like before, but he could feel it, and that was enough. The war ended not with a bang, but with a long, exhausted exhale. Europe fell quiet for the first time in 6 years. The guns stopped. The skies cleared. For millions, peace sounded like music. But for Jack Brenner, peace sounded like nothing at all. He was discharged in the spring of 1946, a shell of the man who once mapped the world through echoes. The Army called his hearing loss service-related disability. They handed him a certificate, a medal, and a ticket home. Nothing in the paperwork mentioned the echo rig, or Aachen, or the day he'd turned silence into salvation. When he arrived in Pennsylvania, his father's workshop was still there, the same dusty wooden sign above the door. Brenner Instruments, Estimania, 1928. His father had built church organs. Jack used to help him, tuning pipes until they sang in perfect harmony. Now, he could only feel the vibrations through his palms. He spent the first few months fixing things, broken radios, water pumps, anything that hummed or clicked. He didn't talk much. The neighbors said the war had made him quiet. They didn't know the war had made him deaf. In 1949, a man from Washington knocked on his door. He wore a suit and carried a briefcase stamped with a single word: classified. "Colonel Raymond Carter, United States Air Force," he said, shaking Brenner's hand. "I read your files, or at least what's left of them." Brenner raised an eyebrow. "Didn't think there was much to read." "There wasn't," Carter admitted. "But what I found, it shouldn't have been possible. You localized an artillery battery with no working instruments. How?" Brenner looked at the floor. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Try me." Brenner hesitated, then said softly, "It wasn't sound. It was memory. You hear enough war. You start recognizing its heartbeat." Carter smiled thinly. "That heartbeat's still out there, Colonel. The Soviets are making noise again." That word "Colonel" caught him off guard. "I'm not in uniform anymore." Carter opened his briefcase. Inside were blueprints, curved metal dishes, microphone grids, schematic lines converging like veins. "We're building something new," Carter said. "We need someone who understands what silence can do." They called it Project Earshot, an array of listening devices buried along Europe's new dividing line, tuned not for speech, but for movement. The idea was simple: detect tanks by their sound before radar could see them. Brenner recognized the circuitry immediately. It was his design refined, weaponized, given a Cold War coat of paint. He stared at the plans for a long time before signing on. Not out of loyalty, but curiosity. By 1952, the first prototypes were operational in West Germany. The devices worked too well. They could detect not just vehicles, but footsteps, heartbeats, even the vibration of wind against wire. Engineers joked that the system could hear ghosts. Brenner didn't laugh. He'd heard them already. One night, while calibrating a test array outside Frankfurt, a young lieutenant asked him, "Sir, what's it like losing your hearing after a life built on sound?" Brenner thought for a long moment before answering. "You stop mistaking noise for truth," he said. "The silence tells you what matters." The lieutenant frowned. "You mean, like instinct?" Brenner shook his head. "No, like consequence." He looked at the blinking lights on the console, remembering the forest at Aachen, the scream of feedback, the deafening roar of everything breaking at once. The machines hummed quietly, listening to a continent that refused to rest. When Brenner retired in 1964, Project Earshot evolved into something new: acoustic mapping systems, early precursors to sonar and battlefield detection networks. None of them bore his name. He didn't mind. He moved west, bought a small house near the Oregon coast. Every morning he'd walk the cliffs at dawn, feeling the rumble of waves through his boots. He never remarried, never joined veterans groups, never spoke publicly about what he'd done. But sometimes, at night, the neighbors swore they saw him standing on the porch, his hand cupped around one ear, smiling faintly as if listening to something only he could feel. Decades later, long after his death, engineers studying early Cold War acoustic systems found fragments of his notes, pages filled with equations and small, almost poetic lines scrawled in the margins. One read, "Sound is just war trying to explain itself. Silence is what's left when the lesson's learned." Jack Brenner never received official recognition. But in military archives, under experimental acoustic detection, his field tag still appears beside one classified annotation: "Subject demonstrated extraordinary ability to locate artillery without mechanical assistance. Recommended future research into cognitive echolocation phenomena." That was how history remembered him. Not as a soldier, not as a scientist, but as the man who heard the war end before anyone else did. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found Brenner's journey moving, take a moment to reflect: do we still hear the echoes of what we create, or have we just learned to live with the noise? Tell me in the comments. What do you think silence would say if it could speak about war? And as always, thank you for keeping these forgotten stories alive.